August 15, 1944. Romanian ace pilot Major Alexandru Popescu had just dismissed the American F6F Hellcat as a fat turkey compared to his sleek Messerschmitt, right before it shot him out of the sky with terrifying precision. Within months, intelligence reports revealed the Hellcat's devastating 19-to-1 kill ratio, a statistic so brutal it shattered everything Romanian pilots believed about American inferiority. But what happens to a warrior's mind when they discover their entire worldview was built on a lie that cost their friends their lives? The morning sun cast long shadows across Băneasa airfield outside Bucharest on March 15, 1944. Romania had been dragged into Hitler's war 3 years earlier, not by choice, but by necessity. After losing chunks of territory to the Soviet Union and Hungary, Marshal Ion Antonescu had no option but to align with Germany. The alternative was complete destruction. Major Alexandru Popescu walked across the oil-stained concrete toward the briefing hut, his leather boots clicking against the worn surface. At 32, he was one of Romania's most experienced pilots, with 15 confirmed kills. His dark hair was slicked back in the German style, and his uniform bore the eagle insignia of the Romanian Air Force. Behind him, mechanics worked on a row of Messerschmitt Bf 109s, their yellow-painted noses gleaming in the early light. The airfield buzzed with the usual morning activity. Ground crews pushed fuel carts between aircraft, while pilots gathered near the operations building. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with cigarette smoke drifted across the field. In the distance, anti-aircraft guns pointed skyward like steel fingers, a reminder that Allied bombers now reached deep into Axis territory. Captain Mihai Ionescu, 24 and eager, jogged up beside Popescu. His young face still carried the confidence of someone who had never truly doubted what he was fighting for. "Have you heard about the new American planes operating from Italy?" he asked, slightly out of breath. "The fat ones," Popescu replied with a slight smile. "The intelligence reports mentioned something about F6F Hellcats. Sounds like another clumsy American design." Inside the briefing room, 20 pilots sat on wooden chairs facing a large map of the Black Sea region. Colonel Stefan Radulescu stood at attention, his weathered face showing the strain of 3 years of war. At 45, he had seen too many young men fail to return from missions. Beside him, a German intelligence officer in a crisp uniform held a manila folder. "Gentlemen," the German officer began in accented Romanian, "American carrier aircraft are now operating from captured Italian bases. They call this new fighter the F6F Hellcat." He opened the folder and pulled out grainy reconnaissance photographs. As you can see, it is a large, heavy machine. Typical American thinking. They believe bigger means better. The pilots leaned forward to examine the photos. The American fighter looked bulky compared to their sleek Messerschmitts. Its wings were thick and straight, lacking the elegant curves of German engineering. The fuselage appeared wide and ungainly. "Look at the size of that thing," Ionescu whispered to the pilot beside him. "It looks like a flying bathtub." Several pilots chuckled. They had been raised on stories of German engineering superiority. Their Messerschmitts were works of art, fast, nimble, and deadly in the right hands. This American machine looked like it had been built by farmers. The German officer continued his presentation. "American pilots receive minimal training compared to our standards. They rely on quantity over quality. Their aircraft are built quickly in factories by workers who have never seen combat. Compare this to your Messerschmitts, crafted with precision by experienced engineers who understand aerial warfare." He showed another photograph of American pilots standing beside their aircraft. They looked young and casual, some even smiling at the camera. Notice their relaxed attitude. This is not the discipline of true warriors. When you encounter these Hellcats, remember that you are facing mechanics and farm boys, not real pilots. Colonel Radulescu studied the photographs with growing unease. Something about the intelligence felt wrong, though he could not pinpoint exactly what. The Americans had surprised everyone with their rapid industrial mobilization. Could they really be as incompetent as the Germans suggested? "Sir," Popescu raised his hand. "What are their reported performance characteristics?" The German officer flipped through his papers. "Maximum speed approximately 380 miles per hour. Slower than your Messerschmitt. Rate of climb inferior to German fighters. Range is extended, but this comes at the cost of maneuverability. In short, gentlemen, you will be facing flying trucks." The room erupted in confident laughter. Pilots exchanged knowing glances and made jokes about American engineering. They had faced Soviet fighters and emerged victorious. They had tangled with British Spitfires over the Mediterranean. How difficult could these new American machines be? Outside the briefing room, mechanics continued their work on the Romanian Messerschmitts. These aircraft had served them well, though spare parts were becoming harder to find. The yellow paint on their noses was beginning to fade and chip. Fuel supplies were also tightening as Allied bombing targeted refineries. 3 days later, the first encounter came without warning. Popescu led a patrol of 3 Messerschmitts over the Black Sea, hunting for Allied reconnaissance aircraft. The morning was clear with unlimited visibility. Below them, the dark water stretched to the horizon. "Contact bearing 2 o'clock high." Ionescu's voice crackled over the radio. 3 aircraft approaching from the southeast. Popescu squinted against the sun and spotted them. 3 dark shapes flying in loose formation, still several miles away. As they closed the distance, he could make out the distinctive silhouette. Broad wings, radial engine, the unmistakable profile of the F6F Hellcat. "This should be easy," he muttered into his microphone. "Remember what we learned in briefing. They are heavy and slow. We have the advantage in turning and climbing." The Romanian fighters positioned themselves for a classic attack. Popescu would take the lead Hellcat, while his wingmen engaged the others. They had practiced this maneuver hundreds of times against similar targets. But something felt different as the distance closed. The American fighters did not behave like the clumsy machines described in intelligence reports. Their formation was tight and professional. When the Romanian Messerschmitts began their attack dive, the Hellcats did not panic or break formation. Instead, they turned directly into the attack. The first burst of machine gun fire from the lead Hellcat caught Lieutenant Vasile Antonescu completely off guard. The Romanian pilot had expected to easily outmaneuver the bulky American fighter, but instead found himself diving desperately toward the sea as tracer rounds streaked past his cockpit. Within 30 seconds, his wingman Lieutenant Cristian Popovici was already spinning toward the water, his Messerschmitt trailing black smoke from a shattered engine. Popescu pulled his aircraft into a sharp climbing turn, trying to gain altitude advantage over the remaining Hellcats. His heart pounded as he realized these American pilots were nothing like the farm boys described in the German briefings. They flew with precision and aggression that matched any Luftwaffe veteran. The lead Hellcat stayed with him through the climb, its powerful radial engine pulling it upward at a rate that shocked him. "These things climb like rockets," Ionescu's panicked voice crackled over the radio as he tried to escape the second Hellcat. The intelligence was wrong. "They are not slow." Popescu watched in horror as Ionescu's aircraft took multiple hits from the pursuing American fighter. The young captain managed to level out just above the water, but his engine was smoking badly. Oil streaked across his canopy as he limped toward the Romanian coast, the Hellcat circling above like a patient hunter. The engagement lasted less than 5 minutes. 2 Romanian Messerschmitts were shot down, and the third barely escaped with severe damage. The 3 Hellcats reformed and continued their patrol as if nothing had happened. No dramatic victory rolls or celebration. Just professional efficiency that chilled Popescu to the bone. Back at Băneasa airfield, the debriefing session was tense and uncomfortable. Colonel Radulescu paced behind his desk while the German intelligence officer studied the combat report with obvious displeasure. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and nervous sweat. "You must have made tactical errors," the German officer insisted. "American pilots lack proper training. Their aircraft are inferior to German engineering. There must be another explanation." Popescu shook his head firmly. "Sir, I have been flying combat missions for 3 years. Those Hellcat pilots knew exactly what they were doing. Their aircraft performed better than our intelligence suggested. Much better." Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated itself with devastating consistency. Romanian squadrons that had once dominated the skies over the Black Sea now suffered terrible losses against American fighters. Experienced pilots who had survived years of combat were being shot down by opponents they had been taught to dismiss. Intelligence reports began arriving from other fronts that painted an increasingly grim picture. In the Pacific Theater, F6F Hellcats were destroying Japanese aircraft at rates that seemed impossible. The numbers were staggering: 19 enemy aircraft shot down for every Hellcat lost. Even accounting for propaganda inflation, the statistics suggested something fundamentally different about American air power. Captain Ionescu, recovering from injuries sustained in his crash landing, sat in the base hospital reading captured American flight manuals. His left arm was still in a sling, but his mind was sharp and troubled. The technical specifications he found contradicted everything they had been told about American aviation. "Listen to this," he said to Popescu during a visit. "The Hellcat has self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plating around the pilot, and redundant control systems. Our Messerschmitts have none of these features. If we take hits in critical areas, we die. If they take the same hits, they fly home." The captured manuals revealed other disturbing truths. American pilots arrived at combat units with over 300 hours of flight training, including extensive gunnery practice with live ammunition. Romanian replacement pilots now received barely 50 hours of training due to chronic fuel shortages. The disparity in preparation was enormous. More shocking was the scale of American industrial production. Intelligence estimates, previously dismissed as Allied propaganda, now seemed conservative. Grumman Aircraft was producing over 500 Hellcats per month from a single factory. The entire Romanian Air Force possessed fewer than 200 fighters of all types. "They are not just building more aircraft," Colonel Radulescu explained to his pilots during a somber briefing. "They are building them better. Each Hellcat incorporates lessons learned from previous combat. They improve the design constantly based on pilot feedback and battle damage analysis." The contrast with Axis production methods was stark. German aircraft designs remained largely unchanged from 1940, with modifications limited by material shortages and manufacturing constraints. Romanian mechanics struggled to find spare parts for their aging Messerschmitts, while American factories churned out new fighters with advanced features. Technical examination of a captured Hellcat revealed sophisticated engineering that German propaganda had never mentioned. The aircraft structure was massively overbuilt for durability, rather than weight savings. Its radial engine could absorb incredible battle damage and continue running. The cockpit provided excellent visibility in all directions, giving pilots crucial advantages in aerial combat. "Look at this ammunition feed system," the chief mechanic explained to a group of pilots gathered around the captured fighter. "It holds 400 rounds per gun, compared to our 60 rounds. When we run out of ammunition, we must return to base. They can stay and fight." The psychological impact on Romanian pilots was devastating. Men who had once approached combat with confidence now took off knowing they were outgunned, outmanned, and flying inferior equipment. The casual dismissal of American capabilities had been replaced by grudging respect, tinged with fear. Night after night, Popescu lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling and wondering how many more friends would die because of intelligence failures and nationalist pride. The fat American turkey had revealed itself to be an eagle, and Romanian pilots were paying the price for their leadership's blindness to reality. In his private moments, Captain Ionescu began questioning everything he had been taught about the war itself. If American aircraft were this superior, what about their other military equipment? Their training methods? Their industrial capacity? The implications were too frightening to discuss openly, but impossible to ignore. August 23, 1944, arrived with news that shattered the foundation of everything Romanian pilots had believed. King Michael had ordered the arrest of Marshal Antonescu and announced Romania's switch to the Allied side. The war that had defined their lives for 3 years had suddenly reversed itself. Pilots who had fought against American aircraft were now expected to fly alongside them. The transformation happened with stunning speed. Within hours of the announcement, Soviet forces were crossing Romanian borders as allies rather than enemies. German units that had been stationed at Romanian airfields fled westward or surrendered. The yellow nose markings that identified Romanian aircraft were hastily painted over with red, white, and blue roundels. Major Alexandru Popescu stood on the flight line at Băneasa Airfield, watching mechanics remove German insignia from his Messerschmitt. The morning air carried the sound of distant artillery as Romanian and Soviet forces engaged retreating German units. Everything he had fought for during the past 3 years had become meaningless overnight. "It feels like waking up from a bad dream," Captain Ionescu said, approaching with his arm still in a sling. His crash injuries from the Hellcat encounter were healing, but slowly. "Except, we are not sure if we are awake or just having a different dream." Colonel Radulescu gathered his remaining pilots in the briefing room that afternoon. Maps of Eastern Europe covered the walls, but the red arrows now pointed in the opposite direction. Allied forces were advancing from the south and west, while Soviet armies pushed from the north and east. Germany was being crushed between enormous industrial powers. "Gentlemen," the colonel began, his voice heavy with exhaustion, "we have new orders. Tomorrow we will escort American bombers attacking German positions in Hungary. The same aircraft we have been fighting are now our allies." The irony was bitter and inescapable. Romanian pilots would fly alongside the F6F Hellcats that had been destroying their squadrons for months. They would witness firsthand the aircraft and crews they had dismissed as inferior amateurs. 3 days later, the moment arrived that would change Major Popescu forever. During a prisoner exchange at a forward airfield near the Hungarian border, he found himself face-to-face with Lieutenant James Morrison from Texas, the Hellcat pilot who had shot him down 2 months earlier. Morrison was 26 years old with sandy hair and calm blue eyes that showed no hatred despite their previous encounter. "You flew that Messerschmitt pretty well," Morrison said in broken German, extending his hand. "Sorry about having to shoot you down, but that is war, I guess." Popescu shook the American's hand, surprised by the lack of animosity. In his experience, combat pilots either celebrated their victories or harbored grudges against defeated opponents. Morrison seemed to view their aerial duel as nothing more than a professional necessity. "Your Hellcat performed much better than our intelligence suggested," Popescu replied carefully. "We were told American fighters were slow and clumsy." Morrison laughed and shook his head. The F6F was not built to win beauty contests. It was designed by engineers who studied every combat report from the Pacific and Europe. Every crashed fighter, every pilot interview, every tactical analysis went into making it better. Over the next hour, Morrison explained the philosophy behind American aircraft design with an openness that stunned Popescu. There were no military secrets, no classified information, just straightforward engineering principles that prioritized pilot survival and mission success over aesthetic appeal or national pride. "See, we figured out early that pretty fighters do not win wars," Morrison continued, gesturing toward his Hellcat parked nearby. "Fighters that bring pilots home alive win wars. The F6F has thick armor around the cockpit, self-sealing fuel tanks, and redundant control systems. If something gets hit, something else takes over." The American pilot opened the Hellcat's cockpit and invited Popescu to look inside. The interior was spacious and functional, with large instruments that could be read easily during combat stress. 650 caliber machine guns were loaded with 400 rounds each, providing sustained firepower that dwarfed the Romanian Messerschmitt's armament. "Our training philosophy is different too," Morrison explained. "We do not expect pilots to adapt to the aircraft. We design aircraft to help pilots succeed. Every system is built to be simple and reliable under combat conditions." That evening, alone in his quarters, Popescu wrote in his personal journal with shaking hands. The words came slowly as he struggled to process what he had learned during his conversation with the American pilot. "Today I understood how completely we have been deceived. We believed that complexity meant superiority, that beautiful aircraft were automatically better aircraft. The Americans proved that engineering excellence comes from solving problems, not creating impressive designs. While we worried about appearance and tradition, they focused on bringing their pilots home alive." The realization went deeper than aircraft design. If American engineers approached aviation with such methodical intelligence, what did that suggest about their approach to everything else? Their industrial capacity, their training methods, their strategic planning had all been dismissed as crude and unsophisticated. The evidence suggested otherwise. "We lost friends because we could not see past our own pride," Popescu continued writing. "Every pilot who died fighting Hellcats was a victim of our leadership's refusal to acknowledge reality. We confused arrogance with confidence and paid for that mistake with blood." The psychological collapse was complete and devastating. Everything Popescu had believed about American weakness, German superiority, and the righteousness of the Axis cause crumbled under the weight of simple facts. The F6F Hellcat had not just shot down Romanian fighters. It had destroyed the propaganda that sustained Romanian faith in ultimate victory. Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by dreams of falling aircraft and burning friends. In the morning, Popescu would wake to a world where former enemies had become allies and former truths had become lies. The war would continue, but his understanding of it had changed forever. September 12, 1945, brought Major Alexandru Popescu back to Băneasa airfield for the first time since the war's end. The train from Bucharest wheezed to a stop at the small station near the base, its cars packed with returning soldiers and displaced civilians. Steam hissed from the locomotive's engine as passengers gathered their meager belongings and stepped onto the platform. The airfield stretched before him like a graveyard of twisted metal and broken dreams. Bomb craters pocked the runways where Allied aircraft had targeted German positions during the final months of fighting. Hangar roofs had collapsed inward, their steel beams reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Weeds grew through cracks in the concrete where Romanian and German fighters had once taxied for takeoff. Popescu walked slowly across the abandoned field, his worn boots crunching on scattered glass and debris. The smell of rust and decay hung in the air, mixed with wild flowers that had sprouted between abandoned aircraft parts. In his jacket pocket, he carried Lieutenant James Morrison's business card and a letter of introduction to American aviation companies. The Texan pilot had kept his promise to help after the war ended. The contrast with American industrial might felt overwhelming as Popescu surveyed the destruction. During his final months flying alongside Allied forces, he had visited American air bases that resembled small cities. Endless rows of aircraft, massive maintenance facilities, and supply depots that stretched to the horizon. The scale of production had been impossible to comprehend for someone raised in a country that struggled to manufacture spare parts. "We built 12,000 F6F Hellcats during the war," Morrison had explained during one of their conversations. Grumman alone produced more fighters than Germany and Japan combined in their best years. That is what real industrial capacity looks like. The numbers still seemed impossible to believe, but the evidence surrounded Popescu everywhere he looked. American aircraft had filled the skies during the war's final phase, appearing in formations so large they blocked out the sun. Romanian pilots had watched in awe as hundreds of bombers passed overhead, escorted by swarms of fighters that dwarfed anything the Axis powers could assemble. 3 weeks later, Popescu received orders to report to the new Romanian Ministry of Defense in Bucharest. The building had been hastily converted from a German administrative center, with fresh paint covering Nazi symbols and new furniture replacing looted offices. The smell of disinfectant could not quite mask the lingering odor of defeat and transition. "Major Popescu," said Colonel Gheorghe Marinescu, the new director of aviation training, "your combat experience and knowledge of American aircraft makes you invaluable for rebuilding our Air Force. We need officers who understand modern aviation principles." The assignment was both an opportunity and a burden. Popescu would oversee pilot training programs based on American methods rather than the German techniques that had proven so inadequate during the war. Everything would need to change, from basic flight instruction to maintenance procedures to strategic thinking about air power. The first class of new cadets reported for training in January 1947. 20 young men gathered in the same briefing room where Romanian pilots had once laughed at photographs of the fat American turkey. The walls now displayed technical diagrams of American aircraft and training manuals translated into Romanian. "Gentlemen," Popescu began, standing before a blackboard covered with performance statistics, "today, we begin learning how to think about aviation differently. For too long, we believed that beautiful aircraft were automatically superior aircraft. The war taught us that engineering excellence comes from solving problems, not creating impressive designs." He pointed to a photograph of an F6F Hellcat mounted beside images of German and Soviet fighters. The American aircraft still looked bulky and ungainly compared to the sleek lines of European designs, but its combat record spoke louder than aesthetic appeal. This aircraft achieved a kill ratio of 19-1 against enemy fighters, not because it was the fastest or the prettiest, but because it was designed to keep pilots alive and complete missions. Every system was built for reliability under combat stress. Every feature served a practical purpose. The cadets listened with the intense focus of young men who had grown up hearing stories of aerial defeat and national humiliation. They understood that their country's survival depended on learning lessons that had been purchased with blood and defeat. Popescu walked to the memorial wall, where photographs of fallen Romanian pilots hung in neat rows. Names and faces of friends who had died fighting aircraft they did not understand, led by officers who refused to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about enemy capabilities. "These men died because we confused arrogance with confidence," he said quietly. "Because we dismissed what we did not want to believe. Because we thought our pride was more important than our pilots' lives." The room fell silent as the weight of those words settled over the cadets. They were inheriting an air force built on the wreckage of previous failures and the hard-won wisdom of bitter experience. 5 years after the war's end, Popescu stood once again before a group of graduating pilots. The rebuilt airfield hummed with activity as maintenance crews worked on American-supplied aircraft. Modern hangars housed fighters designed with the same practical philosophy that had made the Hellcat so devastatingly effective. "Remember what the F6F Hellcat taught us about engineering and warfare," he told the assembled graduates. "Reality always defeats illusion. But the price of learning that lesson can be higher than any nation should pay. Your job is to see clearly, think honestly, and never let pride blind you to facts that might save your lives." The ceremony ended with a moment of silence for the pilots who had paid the ultimate price for their leadership's failure to understand the changing nature of aerial warfare. In the distance, American-built fighters took off on training missions, their engines carrying the sound of hard-won wisdom into the clear Romanian sky.